Namaste, good evening. I'm going to present my views on a very important policy decision taken by Government of India related to National Asset Monetization Pipeline. The policy was presented by Ministry of Finance, Government of India very recently on 25th August 2021, which talked about leasing out various key assets spreaded across ministries, department and central public sector undertaking to lease out these assets to private players in order to generate some revenue. The moment the policy came into being, it was discussed across political spectrum. It was opposed by few, it was welcomed by others, and it was discussed and debated widely by key economists. Based on my understanding of business and my learnings of executive MBA, I am going to present my views on the policy. So, if we go by what was presented by Niti Aayog in their document related to this monetization policy, they said their focus would only be on the brownfield infrastructure assets. So, what are these brownfield infrastructure assets? Brownfield infrastructure assets refers to those assets, be it machinery, be it ports, be it airports, be it different functionaries across departments, CPSEs or ministries which are not generating revenue efficiently, which are not generating revenues at all, or which are hard to monetize or generate revenue. At times, the cost of holding these assets are also high. So, the Niti Aayog in their policy document presented that the key focus of this national infrastructure pipeline would be on brownfield infrastructure projects. What is the government argument? What government is saying that they are going to achieve through this national asset monetization? So the government of India, prior to this asset monetization pipeline, last year in their union budget have also announced a infrastructure pipeline where they have given a humongous target of spending of 1 lakh crore on infrastructure development in next 5 years, which means government of India would have to devise mechanism to generate funds, to create corpus to fund these infrastructure requirement. It was also said by the government of India through the union budget that at least 15 to 20% of the funds would be coming from innovative and alternate funding mechanism, which includes asset monetization, which include development financial institutions and others initiative. How? So how is government going to monetize these assets? Government of India has presented a policy that key assets such as railway tracks, dedicated freight corridors, assets such as airports, assets such as warehouses, assets such as assets such as roads in under national highways would be leased out to private players, but they would not be sold. So the government is very categoric in saying that the ownership of these assets would not be transferred, only the revenue rights would be transferred to the public entities. And in lieu of these transfer of the right, government of India would get a consideration which could be upfront. In most of the cases, they are asking for an upfront consideration, and in some of the cases they have also opted for staggered consideration. The prime focus of government of India is to have funding support in order to support the infrastructure spending they are going to do in next 5 years through their national infrastructure pipeline. Also, government of India is saying apart from generating revenues, the other aspect of monetizing these assets are to unlock the value of the asset, wherein the government is saying that these assets are underutilized, the holding cost of these assets are high, and also the government of India is saying that the private player would be coming and doing capex investment. They would be funding newer innovative technologies in these assets to in order to work out these assets more efficiently. So this is what the government intends to achieve through this national monetization pipeline. But once the government of India is saying that they want to harness, they want to capitalize on these assets, there are certain, if we can say, there are certain acceptances which government of India is making through this policy. First and foremost, government of India very silently is accepting that the government of India and central public sector undertakings themselves are not efficient enough in utilizing these assets. So there could be a sense that very slightly, very silently, government of India is accepting on the front that these assets are not being held properly, these assets are not being managed properly. Second, government of India's key argument is they want funds today so that they can have all those infrastructure projects, but their priority is to get funds today rather than a sustained source of revenue for tomorrow. So as we all know, all these central public sector undertaking themselves are source of sustained revenue for government, even if in meager amount. Third important key argument is private players through this national asset monetizations are also being created an environment to invest. The key argument of government is through the funds they'll get through this monetization pipeline, they will invest in greenfield projects, newer projects, whereas the existing projects, since the capital expenditure is small, the risk is smaller, they would create conducive environment for private players to invest on those assets, to invest on those sectors and work on those sectors. We all would agree in present COVID times, the economic structure is as such that the private players are not getting full confidence for investing in larger projects. Hence, government is of the opinion that the greenfield projects investment would rest on the government's shoulders, vis-a-vis the private players would be encouraged to invest upon the brownfield projects which are laid down under this asset monetization pipeline. So what is up for renting or what is up for lease? So roads worth 1,60,200 crores, railways as many as 90 Rajdhanis and Durantos are up for lease, power transmission lines, power generation facilities, natural gas pipelines, product pipelines, telecom infrastructure, warehousing, mining, aviation, ports, stadium, and urban real estate, such as assets held by ITDC. So you could see all the cash cows which were generating revenues for government of India are up for leasing, or I could say are up for transferring the revenue rights to certain private players. It is also very pertinent and very important to understand that not all private players would be eligible to participate in bidding processes of such asset handover, primarily because the volume is so much that only those conglomerates which have required capacity and bandwidth to invest upon would be able to participate. So what are the issues and challenges which we can see in this policy? First and foremost, the policy talks about the valuation of these assets through a thumb rule. So no large scale survey was taken to assess the real marketable value of these assets, which is itself a big question mark, because if at all these strategic assets are to be handed over, at least their real value should have been discovered. And we all know in the present times, in COVID times, all the business are undervalued. So would it be apt for government of India to up these assets for leasing to private players? Third, second important thing, this policy does not talks about the leasing period. So it does not talks about a cap on the tenure up to which these assets could be handed over. So these handover could be as long as 50, 60 years, primarily because if private players are coming and they are handing over hefty amounts as upfront fee to government of India, so they would like to have a considerable period of time to pay back their investments. Another important aspect was no scientific or statistical method was used to ascertain on which assets are up for leasing and which are not part of this policy. For example, the document talked about 90 Shatabdi and Duronto trains, but the document has not said a single word on passenger train. So what was the criteria to include only Shatabdis and Durontos, which are anyways a source of revenue for government of India as on date, and has put aside other passengers train which are not included in this asset class, such as dedicated freight corridor. So if I could recall, government of India have invested humongous amount of money, time, engineering acumen on developing these dedicated freight corridor, and while the land acquisition of dedicated freight corridor was still on, government of India was always pushing the idea that once the dedicated freight corridor would come into being, the cost of goods and services would come down, the connectivity would be enhanced. And it's not been a year or two that this dedicated freight corridor are into up is up and running. So what is the haste of government of India in putting out this dedicated freight corridor, which otherwise could be a very great source of revenue for Indian Railways, which in fact is reeling for revenues to put this dedicated freight corridor in this monetization pipeline. Certain public sector enterprises such as BSNL and MTNL, which are relying heavily on digital infrastructure, such as their towers, such as BharatNet, which was the network of optical cable across the country, though only and the major source of revenue of these central public sector undertaking was these digital infrastructure. So was it not, would it not be prudent for government of India to help these central public sector undertaking to monetize these assets efficiently and fully by themselves instead of handing over to it to private parties? There is also another fear in employees of these central public sector undertaking, that their jobs could be at loss when they don't have much of work to do on their own, when most of the infrastructure would be handed over. Another important apprehension which is casted by many economists is on the cost. So if all these road infrastructure, digital infrastructure, airports, railways are handed over to private players who would be paying hefty upfront fee to government of India, would it not be coming, the cost would not be going to the end users, because at the end of it, not only they are going to recover the cost which they have paid to government of India, but their own operational cost. So is it not the case that all these services, be it the road tolls, be it the tickets, be it the tariffs, would go multiple times higher than what it is today, and at the end of it, it would be the general public who would be bearing the brunt. Also, there is no say in the present policy about specific requirement of capex investment or quantum of capex investment and modernization which is required to be put forth by private players. So in nutshell, what is to be done? So leasing out assets have always been there, be it in the name of build, operate and transfer, be it in the name of public private partnership, or we can call it by any other name. But as it is said in normal general parlance, renting is the most easiest way to capitalize on any infrastructure, be it small lalas or small businessmen who are renting out their shops and establishment. But would it not be the case if the same established would be up and running by a given company which can give greater job, which can give greater revenues to up exchequer? So there should be a clear scientific and statistical reasoning behind handing over these assets to private player instead of hastily just looking on the immediate revenues the government of India can get in order to fund the infrastructure pipeline which they have proposed in next 5 years. So my submission, my key takeaway is, instead of pooling all these assets together, the asset monetization could be done bit by bit based on logical, scientific, and statistical understanding, and also keeping in view larger public good in terms of cost to general public, in terms of lives and livelihoods of general public, and also taking in view the amount and effort and pain taken by engineers, staffs, and even government of India itself while developing infrastructure, strategic infrastructure such as dedicated freight corridor. So the replacement cost of such infrastructure has to be kept in mind while handing over such key strategic infrastructure to private players. So I would end my argument, I would end my understanding with this important piece of cartoon which was displayed as to, if the government of India is relying on the public sector and public sector itself, or on private sector, and private sector is itself looking on government of India to help themselves, it is the public, it is the people who must come forward, tell the government that it is the government who must roll on their sleeves, keep on their management efficiently, operate their assets, work out to increase the revenues of government exchequer in more efficient and public friendly manner, rather than doing the most simplest job of leasing out them to private player. So with this, I would rest the presentation. Thank you so much.